back to Boni's life. Today, we are going to take a hard, unfiltered look at the United States of America. Not the America of Hollywood movies, not the America of political campaign speeches, and certainly not the America of mainstream media narratives. We are going to look at the American empire. We are going to analyze it through the cold, unforgiving lens of history. Because history does not care about exceptionalism. History does not care about national pride. History only cares about patterns. And when you look at the patterns of every major global empire over the last 3,000 years, a very clear, very sobering picture emerges about exactly where the United States stands today. To understand where America is right now, we first have to understand how empires actually work. They do not just appear and disappear randomly. They follow a life cycle, almost like a biological organism. They are born, they grow, they mature, they age, and eventually they die. Sir John Glubb, a British historian and military commander, studied the lifespans of 11 major empires, from the Assyrians and Persians to the Roman Republic, the Arab Empire, the Ottomans, the Spanish, and the British. What he found was astonishing. Despite massive differences in technology, geography, culture, and religion, almost every single one of these empires lasted for about 250 years. That is roughly 10 generations of human beings. Glubb identified 6 distinct stages that every empire goes through during its 250-year lifespan. It starts with the Age of Pioneers. This is an outburst of extraordinary energy and courage where a poor but hardy people aggressively expand their territory. They are hungry, they are driven, and they are willing to endure incredible hardships. Then comes the Age of Conquest, marked by military expansion and fearless initiative. The empire conquers its neighbors, establishes its dominance, and begins to accumulate resources. This transitions into the Age of Commerce, where the empire creates massive wealth and explores new corners of the earth. During this phase, the ancient virtues of duty, honor, and patriotism are still strong. The society is cohesive, and the people are united by a shared purpose. But then, the rot begins. The age of affluence arrives. The immense wealth generated by commerce begins to change the character of the people. Money replaces honor as the primary objective of the citizens. Education shifts from producing brave, civic-minded patriots to producing people who just want to acquire the qualifications for high-paying jobs. Selfishness replaces public service. The empire becomes defensive, building massive walls instead of expanding. It tries to buy off its enemies with subsidies rather than fighting them. After affluence comes the age of intellect. Knowledge expands, universities proliferate, and intellectualism is celebrated. But this is a trap. Endless discussion and debate replace decisive action. The society becomes paralyzed by over-analysis. And finally, the empire enters the age of decadence. This is the terminal stage. It is characterized by frivolity, extreme pessimism, a massive welfare state, moral decay, and a celebrity culture where athletes, singers, and actors are worshipped instead of statesmen, generals, or innovators. The citizens of the empire no longer make an effort to save themselves because they are no longer convinced that their society is worth saving. They become cynical, divided, and obsessed with trivial entertainment. Now, let us look at the United States. The American Republic was founded in 1776. If we apply Glubb's 250-year timeline, the expiration date for the American Empire is exactly the year 2026. Right now, today, we are sitting at the exact historical marker where empires collapse. But we do not just have to rely on a timeline. We can look at the symptoms. Are we seeing the characteristics of the age of decadence in America today? The answer, unfortunately, is an overwhelming yes. Let us start with the economy, the lifeblood of any empire. Ray Dalio, the billionaire investor who has spent decades analyzing the rise and fall of empires over the last 500 years, warns that the United States is currently in what he calls Stage 5 of the big cycle. Stage 6 is the complete breakdown of the world order. According to Dalio, the markers of this late-stage decline are large and rapidly rising government debts, massive wealth inequality leading to extreme populism, and a movement away from the empire's reserve currency. The economic numbers are absolutely staggering, and they paint a picture of an empire that is mathematically bankrupt. The United States national debt has surpassed $36 trillion. To put that into perspective, The debt-to-GDP ratio is over 120%. The Congressional Budget Office projects that this debt will rise to 175% of GDP by the year 2056. The government is running annual deficits of nearly $2 trillion, and the interest payment on that debt alone now exceeds the entire defense budget. The United States is borrowing money just to pay the interest on the money it already borrowed. This is the definition of a Ponzi scheme. To fund its endless spending, the government has debased its currency. The Federal Reserve prints trillions of dollars out of thin air, which acts as a hidden, regressive tax on the working class through inflation. This is exactly what the Roman Empire did in its final days. Rome clipped its coins, reducing the silver content to fund its massive military and its domestic bread and circuses. America just adds zeros to a digital ledger. The result is the same: the destruction of the currency's purchasing power and the impoverishment of the middle class. And what about wealth inequality? The gap between the rich and the poor in America has reached levels not seen since the Gilded Age, right before the Great Depression. In the third quarter of 2025, the top 1% of American households owned nearly 32% of all the wealth in the country. The collective net worth of America's top 12 billionaires surpasses $2.7 trillion. Meanwhile, the poverty threshold for a family of 4 is sitting at $33,000, a number that is completely detached from the actual cost of living in modern America. Homelessness has surged by 30% in just 2 years, with over 1.1 million people served by homeless response workers in 2024. We have created a two-tiered society. The wealthy elite retreat to luxurious gated enclaves, completely insulated from the consequences of their policies. Meanwhile, the working class struggles to survive in cities plagued by crime, drug addiction, and crumbling infrastructure. The American Society of Civil Engineers recently gave U.S. infrastructure an overall grade of C, with critical systems like transit and stormwater management getting a D. The bridges are rusting, the power grids are failing, and the water systems are contaminated. This is what Imperial decay looks like on the ground. This massive wealth gap has fueled intense political polarization. We are seeing the rise of extreme populism on both the right and the left. The political divide has become so toxic, so deeply entrenched, that risk analysis firms like the Eurasia Group have listed U.S. political violence as the #1 global threat for 2026. We are witnessing pre-Civil War type developments where tribalism has completely replaced national unity. People are grouped by immutable characteristics, race, gender, sexual orientation, and pitted against each other by politicians and media corporations who profit from the division. As Glubb noted in his historical analysis, when the unity of an empire deteriorates, assimilation becomes impossible and the society fractures from within. A house divided against itself cannot stand, and the American house is deeply fundamentally divided. Then there is the military aspect. Yale historian Paul Kennedy coined the term Imperial Overstretch to describe how great powers fall. They take on more global military commitments than their domestic economies can sustain. They try to police the entire world, and in doing so, they bankrupt themselves. The United States is the textbook definition of imperial overstretch. The U.S. currently maintains between 750 and 800 military bases in over 80 countries around the world. It accounts for nearly 40% of all global military spending, with a defense budget of over $830 billion for 2026. Since the end of World War II, the United States has been involved in a never-ending series of wars and regime change operations. The American public is told these wars are about spreading democracy and protecting human rights, but the reality is far darker. It is about maintaining imperial control. Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War, a disastrous 20-year occupation of Afghanistan, the invasion of Iraq based on fabricated evidence of weapons of mass destruction, the destruction of Libya, the arming of rebels in Syria, drone strikes in Somalia and Yemen. The U.S. has been at war for approximately 225 of its 250 years of existence. And that does not even count the covert operations. The CIA has orchestrated or supported coups and assassinations all over the globe. They overthrew the democratically elected government of Iran in 1953 to protect British oil interests. They overthrew the government of Guatemala in 1954 to protect the profits of the United Fruit Company. They assassinated Patrice Lumumba in the Congo. They backed the military coup against Salvador Allende in Chile in 1973. Through Operation Condor, the U.S. supported brutal right-wing dictatorships across Latin America, in Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Uruguay, and Paraguay, resulting in the torture and disappearance of tens of thousands of political dissidents. The American empire has ruthlessly weaponized its military and its intelligence agencies to maintain global hegemony, crushing any nation that dares to defy its dictates. But that hegemony is now cracking. The world is waking up to the reality of American imperialism, and they are pushing back. The most significant threat to the American empire today is not a foreign military invasion. It is the loss of its economic dominance. For decades, the United States has weaponized the US dollar through aggressive economic sanctions. If a country disobeys Washington, they are cut off from the global financial system. But this constant weaponization of the dollar has forced the rest of the world to seek alternatives. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, along with their new members, are actively accelerating de-dollarization efforts. They are building alternative payment systems and trading in their own local currencies. The US dollar's share of global reserves has dropped from 65% in 2005 to around 57% today, and that decline is accelerating. When an empire loses its reserve currency status, it loses its exorbitant privilege. It loses its ability to export its inflation to the rest of the world. It loses its ability to fund its massive deficits by simply printing money. When the dollar loses its dominance, the financial house of cards that sustains the American empire will collapse, and the resulting economic shockwave will devastate the American standard of living. We are also seeing a profound social and moral decay, which is the ultimate hallmark of Glubb's age of decadence. A healthy society values life, family, and community. A decaying society descends into nihilism and despair. American life expectancy has actually been declining in recent years, a shocking development for a supposedly advanced nation. This decline is driven in large part by an opioid crisis that has ravaged the working class. Opioid-related deaths wiped out over 3 million years of human life in a single year. Millions of Americans are numbing themselves with fentanyl and painkillers because they see no future, no hope, and no purpose in a society that has abandoned them. The culture itself is dominated by frivolity and celebrity worship. We care more about the opinions of actors, pop stars, and athletes than we do about the structural integrity of our republic. The mainstream media feeds the public a constant diet of outrage, gossip, and mindless entertainment, the modern equivalent of Roman bread and circuses. The political class has become hopelessly corrupt, functioning as a uniparty that serves the interests of corporate donors and the military-industrial complex while ignoring the desperate pleas of the common citizen. When you look at the fall of the Roman Empire, the parallels to modern America are absolutely chilling. Rome did not fall in a single day. It was not conquered by a sudden, overwhelming force. It was a slow, agonizing bleed from within. Confiscatory taxes drove commerce underground. Idle laborers relied on government handouts. The military became overextended, relying on foreign mercenaries to fight its battles, leaving the borders vulnerable to barbarian invasions. The currency was repeatedly debased to pay for endless wars and domestic welfare programs. The political elite became decadent, corrupt, and completely disconnected from the realities of the plebeians. Foreign wars were used to distract the populace from domestic failures. The United States is walking down the exact same path, step by step, mistake by mistake. We have transitioned from a republic of hardy pioneers who believed in self-reliance and liberty to an empire of captious citizens demanding more and more from a welfare state that is mathematically bankrupt. We have traded the virtues of duty, sacrifice, and civic responsibility for the illusions of endless material comfort, instant gratification, and digital entertainment. Let us dig deeper into the historical comparisons, because the Roman Empire is not the only precedent. Look at the British Empire. At its peak, the sun never set on the British Empire. It controlled a quarter of the world's landmass and population, but the British Empire collapsed under the weight of 2 world wars and massive debt. By 1945, Britain was financially exhausted. It could no longer afford to maintain its global military presence or suppress independence movements in its colonies. The United States stepped in to fill the vacuum, establishing the post-war order. Now, the United States finds itself in the exact same position Britain was in after World War II, financially exhausted, militarily overextended, and facing a rising challenger in the form of China. Look at the Spanish Empire. In the 16th century, Spain was the wealthiest and most powerful nation on earth, fueled by the gold and silver it extracted from the Americas. But Spain squandered its wealth on endless religious wars in Europe. It failed to develop a productive domestic economy, relying entirely on the influx of precious metals. When the gold and silver ran out, the Spanish Empire collapsed into irrelevance. The United States has done the exact same thing. We have hollowed out our manufacturing base, sending our factories and jobs overseas in pursuit of cheap labor. We have transformed from a nation that builds things into a nation that consumes things, relying entirely on the artificial strength of the US dollar to buy cheap goods from the rest of the world. When the dollar loses its value, our ability to consume will vanish, and we will be left with a hollowed-out economy that produces nothing of real value. Look at the Soviet Union. The Soviet Empire collapsed in 1991, not because it was defeated in battle, but because its economic system was fundamentally flawed and its military was overextended in places like Afghanistan. The Soviet leadership was corrupt, geriatric, and completely out of touch with the suffering of the Soviet people. The system rotted from the inside out until it simply imploded. The United States is currently governed by a gerontocracy, a political class of elderly elites who have been in power for decades, enriching themselves while the country crumbles around them. They are just as out of touch with the American working class as the Soviet Politburo was with the Russian proletariat. The historical evidence is overwhelming. The symptoms of imperial decline are everywhere you look. The massive debt, the currency debasement, the extreme wealth inequality, the political polarization, the military overstretch, the endless wars, the loss of reserve currency status, the declining life expectancy, the crumbling infrastructure, the moral decay, the celebrity worship, the bread and circuses. The United States has checked every single box on the checklist of a dying empire. Is the fall of the American empire inevitable? History suggests that once the stage of decadence is reached, the momentum is incredibly difficult to reverse. The internal rot usually invites external challenges. We are seeing that now with the rapid rise of China, the resurgence of Russia, and the global shift toward a multipolar world. The post-1945 American-led world order is officially breaking down. The unipolar moment is over. The era of American global dominance is coming to an end. However, human beings are not entirely bound by historical determinism. America has faced massive existential crises before. The Civil War nearly tore the nation apart. The Great Depression brought the economy to its knees. In both instances, the country managed to endure and reinvent itself. But turning this ship around today would require a monumental shift in national consciousness. It would require a level of political courage and public sacrifice that currently does not exist in Washington or in the broader culture. To save the Republic, America would have to dismantle its imperial military footprint. It would have to close hundreds of overseas bases, bring the troops home, and stop trying to police the world. It would have to drastically reduce the size and scope of the federal government, slashing spending to balance the budget. It would have to restore sound money, ending the Federal Reserve's ability to print wealth out of thin air. It would have to secure its borders and enforce the rule of law. It would have to rebuild its domestic manufacturing base and become a productive economy once again. And most importantly, it would have to rediscover a shared civic virtue that transcends the toxic tribal politics of the modern era. Right now, the window for that kind of deep structural reform is closing rapidly. The American empire is in its late stages. The 250-year clock is ticking and the alarm is ringing. The patterns of history are flashing red. We can either acknowledge reality, face the hard truths, and make the painful sacrifices necessary to save the Republic, or we can continue to distract ourselves with bread and circuses while the empire collapses under the weight of its own arrogance, debt, and moral decay. The choice is ours, but time is running out. We cannot ignore the lessons of history forever. the Assyrians, the Persians, the Romans, the Ottomans, the Spanish, the British, they all thought their empires would last forever. They all believed they were exceptional. They were all wrong. The laws of history apply to everyone, including the United States of America. It is time to wake up. Thank you for joining me on Boni's Life. Stay informed, stay vigilant, question the mainstream narrative, and I will see you in the next episode.